Hello everyone, I'm Grandmaster Denes Boros, and today I'm going to show you another legend of the Benoni variation, and that is Garry Kasparov. From his youth, he was enamored and excited to play this variation as he saw his own hero, Bobby Fischer, play it, as we've seen in the previous video, where he faced off against Wolfgang Ullmann. So let's take a look. So d4, knight f6, c4. Modern ways, they often play with e6, c4, c5, takes, d6, knight c3, and g6, because in this way you do have some extra options and you may actually put your knight on e7 instead of f6. But this is still the traditional era where all of the players in the 70s and late 80s, they still play it knight f6, e6, and straight up. So c4, c5, e5, e6, knight c3, takes, d6, and this is the traditional Benoni setup. The whole point of the Benoni is that you get a protected pass pawn which will be an asset towards the endgame. However, in the middle game, white will get a very good pull in the middle. So knight f3, g6, e4, bishop g7. Now, modern times, there is an argument that bishop g7 could be avoided in favor of a6, threatening this move of b5, and if a4, then you have this idea of bishop g4, hitting that knight, pinning it, and if you go bishop e2, then go bishop g7, and already sort of forcing the idea of trading the bishop, which is usually not too well placed on c8. Bishop g7, and here the main popular line is h3, castles, and bishop d3, basically avoiding this pinning line where the bishop would be kind of aggressively positioned. Bishop e2, but they're still sort of following that famous game between Fischer and Ullmann. Castles. And interestingly enough, Kasparov doesn't follow exactly the footsteps of Fischer. Fischer actually inserted a6 and e4, believing that is actually to his benefit. He played bishop g4 instead, but the idea is the same. He is trying to pressure that knight, maybe even trade it, because he believes that the knights are much more valuable in this position, and this bishop really doesn't have any future. Bishop f4, rook e8, sort of setting up the same trick that Fischer did against Ullmann, which followed h3 and knight takes c4, which is quite a beautiful idea. And after knight takes, rook takes, you may not capture because rook takes f4, and if they go bishop g5, there is queen e8, hitting that bishop just in time and basically winning a pawn for the good. Now, Magerramov, who also became a grandmaster later on, decided to play queen c2, which is way more reasonable. You're over-defending the e4 square, and try to see where to go from this situation. a6, sort of following the footsteps of Fischer. Now, we have to remember that our biggest weakness whenever we play the Benoni is the d6 pawn, so we've got to do everything in our power to stop our opponent from pressing it. So a6 is not only a defensive move, stopping this idea, but is also an aggressive one, trying to play b7 to b5 and start pressing that knight on c3. Because if that b3, b5, b4, c3 knight is attacked, then the e4 pawn may as well just fall. h3, and of course, Garry is happy to oblige. He wants to exchange off that bishop. And this is actually the first moment I do ask you to stop and ponder a little bit just to figure out where would you put this queen on d8. Obviously, it has to be put somewhere. If you would go knight d7, that d6 pawn would drop, and we can't really do that. So, if you're back from this little intermezzo where you figure out, well, there were basically two options. If you were wondering about queen e7 or queen c7, you were correct. Queen b6 is not really the place for the queen because A, it blocks this pawn, B, it might actually run into some attack if that rook ever lines up on the b file. So bishop takes, queen c7. And this is always a difficult question to tell. Some people believe queen e7 is the better one because it never really gets into the x-ray of the bishop, but others actually concur and say, well, in this case, I can go c4 and try to actually expand on the queen side. a4 and c4, here it comes. So he's waiting with knight b d7, but he does that so he has these outposts for on c5 and e5. e5, knight d7, rook a4. Trying to press this pawn. But understanding the dynamic nature is most probably the most important thing when you're learning the Benoni. Usually, black doesn't really care for the well-being of the pawn. Mostly, she cares about the pressure along the diagonal and the pressure that he can get. Now, knight c5 wouldn't be good enough, though, because rook takes c4, we lose the pawn, and we don't really have enough time to capture there due to this b4 pin, not to mention that this pawn on d6 would fall. So this b4 move is a problem there, and also bishop takes d6 would lose a pawn, and this knight would lose an outpost as well. So instead, Kasparov played knight to e5, hitting that bishop. I mean, if he could, he would eliminate the bishop pair from Magerramov, but mostly is just trying to actually wall up that bishop on f4. So bishop takes c5, which is, I would consider, a big mistake, because now this bishop has no counterpart and will become monstrous, as we'll see along this game. Bishop e2. So far so good. Black is getting a very, very solid situation. The only thing he needs to do is undermine the e-pawn and the d-pawn eventually. So he goes rook e8, does not really care about the c4 pawn's well-being. And if there would be bishop takes c4, there's knight takes c4, knight takes c4, rook takes e4. And there is this old dogma, opposite colored bishops probably is going to be a draw. Well, this is not the case, especially not in the Benoni, because this bishop is actually going to be monstrous and will help out with the attack. This bishop is actually just hitting a granite, a wall of pawns. It really can't go through and doesn't really have any targets to latch onto, unlike this bishop, which will be very much useful. So rook takes c4. He of course wants to avoid that. Queen takes a5. Now oftentimes black would voluntarily give up the pawn even if he doesn't win the a-pawn back, if he can get this dark square domination, which is considered to be compensation most of the time. f4. And f4 is actually a very dangerous move. White wants to roll over black, but it comes at a price. The black squares are extremely weakened, and if this bishop ever comes close, that will be deadly. Rook e7, bishop f3. So far so good for Kasparov, but now he needs to act resolutely. If Magerramov has some time to coordinate and actually go for e5, there'll be trouble. So Kasparov is quick to be the first one to counterpunch, goes for b5, tries to get rid of that rook on c4 and prepares this b4 push, which will eliminate another defender of that e4 pawn. Rook c6, b4. Again, already, white cannot really move that knight because knight takes c4. Not only do you lose the pawn, but you have an additional target on d5, not to mention bishop d4 check, which is going to be kind of dangerous as white's king is getting all too tender on the dark squares. So Magerramov played the creative e5, but of course Kasparov does not mind getting a position with opposite colors, as this bishop on f3 is merely a tool and is somewhat useless. B takes, rook e1. Just coming on in there, putting pressure on the king, and with this rook seemingly active but really just being far away, black is technically up a rook in the attack. Queen d3, trying to hold up some squares. Rook takes f1, queen takes, bishop takes c3. Obviously, Kasparov doesn't care about these pawns. He only cares about the safety of that king. Rook e1 is a huge threat. Queen takes a6, bishop d4 check, queen e1, and white had to promptly resign as queen g1, and of course this idea of bishop g1, bishop f2 check is on the cards and it's game over. So if h4, obviously it's mate in 1, you can't run away. Otherwise, there is this typical mating pattern of check, check again, and queen g1 mate there is actually another solution of bishop g3, but probably queen g1 is the simplest. So after queen e1, Magerramov resigned, and Kasparov won a blistering game with the Benoni. So I hope you really enjoyed this video on how Kasparov played the Benoni. And if you like it, please like or subscribe. And if you have any questions, please post it below. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.